This country has wallowed in the original sin of slavery and has been trapped in a purgatory of unrepentant denial of accountability. This retelling of the history, this recounting of these incidents is important to create the historical context that we might understand the condition that we find our communities in. They didn't just come to exist in a state of disrepair just because. There were systematic efforts to destroy and disempower and disenfranchise these communities. And so when we look at violence in our communities, when we look at police harassment in our communities, when we look at the substandard quality of the education in our communities, we must understand that there is a legacy and a history of oppression before we begin to or continue to move on and struggle and fight. And so the result of this is that we have a country where life outcomes are statistically determined by race. And justice is not afforded to all. And so I'm thinking about Dr. King and his letter from a Birmingham jail. And he wrote, and it's very well known, that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So therefore, I draw the conclusion that racial justice is a condition precedent for there to be justice for all. Racial justice is the elimination of the structural and institutional barriers that impact life outcomes. Those outcomes that are impacted by race. And it ensures that life, health, and equity regardless of race. Racial justice is the epitome of Dr. King's so-called beloved community. So let us consider this notion of justice for all. I think most would be, the most familiar source of this for many is the Pledge of Allegiance. And what I'm not sure that most are familiar with is the inception of the Pledge of Allegiance, or its original author, or the various iterations of the Pledge of Allegiance, or when it became a compulsory part of our educational process. The pledge was put out there by someone named Francis Bellamy. Francis Bellamy was a Baptist member and a self-proclaimed Christian socialist. He wrote a pledge that was to be quick and to the point to address what he perceived as the lull in patriotism and the growing lack of allegiance, given the rise of immigrants that had been coming to the country. Now, Bellamy's pledge originally read, "I pledge allegiance to my flag and the republic for which it stands, one nation indivisible with liberty and justice for all." It's very quick, it's very short, it's very to the point, and it's amazing when you think of some of the more conservative pundits that are out there that are arguing for the place and the prominence of the pledge, and particularly the placing in the discussion of under God in the pledge. They would be surprised to know, I think, that that was not originally included in the pledge, and I think they would also be surprised to know that it was written by a socialist. But what was left out, or what could have been potentially included in the original pledge, were the words equality and fraternity. Now see, these words were important to Bellamy's socialist values, but given the concerns over the demands of women and African Americans at the time for justice and equality, the words were left out. And so now the pledge's proclamation of justice for all without equality is indicative of this nation's attitude towards African Americans and other people of color and our position of resistance throughout history of this country. You have always been fighting and struggling to be included in the narrative of this nation's history in a way that affirms us and that is positive and that lifts us up. So what is justice without equality? It's the hollow promise of a morally bankrupt guarantee. Justice without equality is a well-pled complaint on a time-barred cause of action. Justice without equality is an all-you-can-eat buffet with a small plate and a time limit. Put that where you can get it. The fallacy of justice without equality provides this false sense of security in an era of alleged post-racial society. A society where the grievances of groups like Black Lives Matter or Concerned Students 1950 or the Million Hoodie Movement or any number of non-traditional grassroots movements in the black community are looked upon with disdain and disrespect or dismissed because they are not respectful. Justice without equality makes it okay for 1/5, roughly 19% of all black families in Massachusetts to be officially impoverished, and 28.2% of all Latino families to be impoverished, compared to 4.8% of white families in Massachusetts who are impoverished. Justice without equality makes it okay for blacks and Latinos to have significantly higher unemployment rates than whites, with black unemployment hovering around 16.5% and the Latino unemployment rate at 14.3%. Justice without equality makes it okay for the home ownership rates of blacks to be around 32.7% and Latinos at around 25%, remaining significantly lower than the rates of whites who are at nearly 70% home ownership. It makes it okay for blacks and Latinos to make up roughly 16% of the Commonwealth's population, but yet they make up 32 or more percent of the people who are incarcerated, and 43% of the people who are incarcerated on drug offenses, and 75% of the people who are serving sentences on drug offenses that carry a mandatory minimum sentence. And this is particularly disturbing when there is empirical data that shows that blacks and Latinos use drugs at the same way as whites. So justice without equality makes it okay for black males between the ages of 15 and 19 to be killed by the police at 31.17 per million, while whites the same age were killed by police at a rate of 1.4 per million in the time frame between 2010 and 2012. Justice without equality makes it okay for 12-year-old Tamir Rice to be shot and killed for playing in the park with a BB gun while white militiamen take over a federal property and are greeted by the local sheriff with a handshake. We can no longer tolerate justice without equality. We can no longer condemn university students whose protest forced the resignation of the university's president, or the protesters in Chicago whose protests caused an estimated 25 to 50% loss of revenue on Black Friday. We cannot condemn them because, as Ida B. Wells said, the appeal to the white man's pocket has ever been more effectual than all the appeals ever made to his conscience. We can no longer condemn these actions without condemning the contingent, intolerable conditions that precipitate them. So I'm reminded of a parable about a flock of doves. And this flock of doves had been migrating, and they were flying and had become weary and hungry during their journey. And the leader of the flock encouraged them to press on a little further so that they might find something to eat. A little while later, they spotted some grains of rice under a tree. And the leader of the flock said, let's go down to this tree and have these grains of rice. And while they were there feeding themselves, this heavy net fell down on them. And the birds began to panic and fluttered because they were ensnared and they were unable to get free.
Can you tell me where that's coming from?
It's an old, from my understanding, it's an old Indian proverb or parable. And so as they struggled to get free, they noticed that there was a hunter approaching, and the flock began to panic. But the leader told them she had a plan. She said, if each of us grab a piece of this net and begin to fly, we can lift up this net and fly away. And so they all grabbed a piece of the net in their beaks, and they all began to flutter their wings, and they began to slowly lift up collectively, carrying the net. And the hunter noticed this and began to pursue them and chase after them. But the more that the hunter chased, the higher the birds got, and the further they flew away, until they got away and the hunter gave up pursuit of the birds. Still constrained by the net, the leader told the flock, well, let's fly to a nearby mouse that I know. And they told the mouse when they landed the story. And instead of asking the mouse to free her, the leader wanted to ensure that the rest of her flock was freed first. And so the mouse began to nibble away at the net, eventually freeing all of the doves. And so now I think about the uncomfortable political climate that we find ourselves in. I think about the gross racialized disparity and the corporatized exploitation of the poor, and that have us as a nation ensnared and doomed for the fate at the hands of the hunter. Racial justice is the intentional effort of each of us, individually taking our piece of the problem and collectively flying away to safety. So we must recognize, as Dr. King wrote in his letter from a Birmingham jail, that in addition to injustice anywhere being a threat to justice everywhere, that we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. So we must advocate. This is where we get to the point of what to do next. We must advocate for the things that we are concerned about, for the things that are right. We must be a part of the organizations that are doing the work, that are on the ground, that are pushing the issues, that are speaking truth to power. These are the things that we must do. We must not lead from the back, but we must lead from the front with lifting up our voices and raising our concern. We must continue to put ourselves in situations where we are learning from others who are not like us. We must continue to make the call for freedom. We must continue to make the call for justice. We must continue to make the call to our elected officials so that they might enact and further legislation on priority issues for us. And if you don't know what the priority issues are, have the conversations with the people that you are concerned about. Have the conversations with the organizations that are doing the work. Have the conversations with the people that are impacted by the things that are creating the maladies in their lives. And you get on the phone and you call your elected officials and say, these are the policy priorities that you need to advance. These are the things that you need to talk about. These are the things that need to inspire you to march, that need to inspire you to protest, the things that need to inspire you to resist. We cannot be satisfied with just freeing ourselves. We must ensure that we all get free. We must recognize that our destiny as a nation and as individuals are linked together, and therefore racial justice is justice for all. Thank you.
I cannot possibly hope to follow that up, so I'm not going to try, other than to thank Mr. Hall again.
Yes.
Thank Mayor Simmons.